Panel show that's just like the news, and the left fights the right, and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was, in fact, a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat, naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome to On the Money, and it's on the money off the rails, with the UK enduring the biggest rail strike in a generation. I'm Liam Halligan, and for the next hour we'll be discussing that strike. Are we heading back to the 70s? Is the RMT Rail Union right to strike for higher pay, or has the public already lost patience? Plus, we'll be hearing from GB News correspondents across the country and discussing the Eurozone, for there are growing signs the single currency is coming under strain. A decade on from when Greece was almost thrown out of the single currency, could we be on the brink of another Eurozone crisis? On the money, after the GB News headlines, Tams and Roberts.
Liam, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Crisis talks were held during a cabinet meeting this morning as the worst rail strikes in more than 3 decades caused major travel chaos across the UK. Tens of thousands of union members have walked out, demanding an 11% pay rise after last-minute talks failed yesterday. Our Home and Security editor, Mark White, has been looking at the disruption so far.
At one of London's busiest train stations, it was anything but this morning. A largely empty concourse at Waterloo. Indeed, at stations right across the capital, as the vast majority of commuters clearly got the message that 80% of rail services are suspended.
It took me half an hour longer than normal.
Right.
Had to go via Norwood and then back into London Bridge.
I get it, especially after COVID. There needs to be some job increases. There needs to be maybe a bit of a pay rise, but if everyone's working from home, there's no real impact. Like I said, my train wasn't busy. We just got stuck outside.
At Birmingham New Street, passenger numbers there were a fraction of what would normally be seen on a weekday rush hour. This train to Northampton was busy, one of a vastly reduced timetable of services to some key locations. In Scotland and Wales, the disruption is even more severe. This was Linlithgow station this morning. ScotRail say there are currently no services outside the central belt, and only a handful of trains on the normally packed commuter services.
It actually works out a bit better, the times they've put on today, but it's very frustrating, the train strikes.
I was going to go and work in the office. I still could, but I'll be honest, I'm just going to go and work from home instead of working in the office.
At Cabinet, the Prime Minister warned the public they must be prepared for more disruption.
We need to get ready to stay the course, because these reforms, these improvements in the way we run our railways are in the interest of the travelling public.
There were no signs of any Labour politicians at this picket line amid reports the Labour leadership has banned them from turning up. Union bosses warned of further action unless management meet their demands.
This is a lawful dispute under the legislation that the Tories brought in themselves. And every time we meet the hurdles and break the thresholds that they brought in, they want to change the law again. We've got the most draconian laws in Western Europe and in any democracy, in fact, anti-trade union laws. Whatever they bring in, we'll meet that challenge and we'll continue to campaign, and if necessary we'll take effective industrial action when we need to.
The Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury has urged the government to play a more active role in trying to bring about an end to the dispute.
Remember, this may not just be about railways. There's a possibility of disputes in other sectors too, And if ministers simply stand back and say this is the wedge issue of the week, this is the issue upon which we can divide the country this week instead of something else, that is a lack of responsibility. It's a dereliction of duty, and we need better than that from the government.
Although many of those who can will have opted to work from home today, many others took to the roads for their daily commute. The M1 in County Durham, one of the many routes busier than normal. With a tube strike in the capital adding to the misery, London buses are much busier than normal. The frustration obvious among those who can't get on board. Many other commuters, like me, opted for a taxi to work, although cab fares have been increased. With good weather forecast across the week, many others have taken the bike to work. The government says it's actively planning to change employment laws to allow for the likes of agency workers to step in any future disputes. But that won't help with this current set of strikes, which are expected to cause travel chaos across the entire week. Mark White, GB News.
In other news, one person has been taken to hospital after a fire on the 12th floor of a high-rise residential block in West London. They were treated for smoke inhalation. Meanwhile, 30 residents were evacuated from the building, and those who weren't directly affected were advised to stay in their flats. The building is close to Grenfell Tower, which was destroyed by a fire 5 years ago, killing 72 people. Incident Commander Liam Hall says the fire is now under control.
Approximately 20 past 9 this morning, the London Fire Brigade were called to a fire on the 12th floor of Stebbing House. Crews from the London Fire Brigade attended within minutes.
Vladimir Putin says Russia plans to launch its newly tested intercontinental ballistic missiles by the end of the year. The Sarmat missiles are capable of reaching the United States. The Russian president has been addressing graduates of military academies in Moscow. He also pledged to strengthen the country's armed forces, which have suffered significant losses in Ukraine. A Russian man who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize has sold his medal for £84 million to help Ukrainian children displaced by the war. Dmitry Muratov, a fierce critic of President Putin, was the co-winner of the 2021 prize for his efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. He was editor of a newspaper which ceased operations in March after threats from the Kremlin over its coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. Crowds have returned to Stonehenge to mark the summer solstice for the first time in 2 years. The sun rose over the stones at around 10 to 5 this morning and won't set until almost 9:30 this evening, giving more than 16 and a half hours of daylight. The summer solstice has been celebrated at Stonehenge for thousands of years, with the stones framing the sun as it rises. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Liam and On the Money.
And coming up on The Money today, it's the biggest rail strike in a generation, and it's only just begun. The RMT rail unions taking industrial action today, Thursday and Saturday, bringing Britain's rail network to its knees. Does the public back the rail unions' bid for higher wages? Or has the country already lost patience with union bosses who seem determined to take us back to the 70s? As ever, we hold grown-up discussions with people who really know their stuff. Plus, ongoing rail strikes are being felt by the taxpayer, with around £100 million predicted to be lost in fare revenue. We'll be hearing from the Taxpayers Alliance, who are protesting outside RMT offices in North London. Plus, each day on The Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview. Today we meet Gordon Kerr, an experienced banker and expert on the financial mechanics of the Eurozone. 10 years on from the last Eurozone crisis, there are growing fears that the single currency again faces the prospect of collapse. Gordon Kerr, who's advised countless Eurozone governments during the last crisis in 2011-12, tells us why, as inflation and interest rates rise, European Monetary Union could once again be in danger. That's later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. Have you been affected by today's strikes? What do you think of the RMT's action? Email us, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet @GBNews. And stay with us because this is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan and we're off the rails with On the Money. So the country's being battered by the biggest rail strike in decades as railway workers begin a 3-day walkout. Around 40,000 members of the RMT union at Network Rail and across 13 train operating companies are striking after last-ditch talks collapsed. Just 1 in 5 trains are running at the moment, primarily on main lines, with London Underground workers also striking. The RMTs rejected a 3% pay rise from Network Rail, asking for an increase closer to inflation, currently approaching 10%. The two sides seem poles apart, suggesting this week's strikes could be the first of many. Today, the RMT and Unite unions are striking on London Underground and the National Rail Network. That National Rail strike will be repeated on Thursday the 23rd and Saturday the 25th of June. On Sunday the 26th, the ASLEF Train Drivers Union will hold industrial action in Hull. And on the 28th and 29th of June, and then again the 13th and 14th of July, ASLEF will again strike on the Croydon Tramlink in South London. And Network Rail staff themselves could also strike on the 25th of July if the TSSA union votes for industrial action. The question now is, could these rail strikes spark widespread industrial action across a range of sectors, as happened during the late 1970s? Back then, high inflation caused real wages to fall, and as earnings lagged behind price rises, many trade unions did take strike action. The same fall in real wages is happening today. Yet while over half the workforce was unionised 40 years ago, today it's just a quarter. So unions are much less powerful. Having said that, the rail unions are now causing havoc. Workers can't get to work and countless kids, including those taking exams, can't get to school. The RMT says this strike's about fairness and justice, but I say, as industrial action threatens to become more widespread, the public is already losing patience. And that's our on-the-money question today. Have the rail unions misjudged the public mood? Grown-up conversations with people who know their stuff. That's what we do here on The Money. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Lucy Massoud, a trade unionist and barrister. Lucy, you're always welcome on the show. Lauren Harkin is an employment lawyer at RWK Goodman. And in the studio, Jasmine Birtles, founder and editor at moneymagpie.com. Jasmine, a pleasure as ever. Lucy, let's hear from you first. You are a trade unionist and a barrister. What's your take on these strikes? Do you think the RMTs misjudged the national mood?
It's a difficult one. As much as I support this strike, of course I do. And what I will know about the RMT is this would have been their last resort. I'd been a firefighter for 12 years. I went on strike on a number of occasions. It was never something I ever wanted to do. I didn't join the fire service to go on strike. I joined the fire service to save lives. And of course, when you are on strike, you're not being paid. So I know that the RMT would have been around the negotiation table for years leading up to this. And we know that because this is the first national strike in over 30 years. So this is not a decision that they've taken lightly. It is going to upset many people. As you've said, there's some people who aren't going to be able to get to work. Children are going to not be able to get to school, etc. But at the same time, we need to remember that the RMT have tried everything they can to avoid this strike. They've tried to negotiate with the government. We've got 40,000 railway workers who, for years now, have been underpaid, who have been subjected to pay freezes, who now find themselves in the middle of a cost of living crisis, are also facing mass job losses. In London, they're facing threats to their pensions. But at the same time, what we see is these fat cat rail bosses who are raking in over £500 million profit per year. And that includes managers who decided it was a good idea to give themselves massive bonuses during a pandemic. All those RMT workers are asking is for some of that £500 million profit to be distributed to their members and for them to be given a decent wage.
Lauren, let's hear from you. Lauren Harkin, you're an employment lawyer. Back in the 70s, of course, there was widespread industrial action, including a lot of private sector workers as opposed to just public sector workers. A half of all the workforce in Britain was unionised then. Now it's around 26, 27%, and not so much in the private sector. How has trade union law changed since then? How has laws surrounding strike action changed since then? Do you think the law could stop us getting into another late 70s widespread industrial action type situation when, you know, tens of millions of days were lost in strike action?
I think the current strikes are not going to have as much sort of havoc as we have seen, you know, sort of 30, 40 years ago. And that is largely due to the fact that the laws relating to trade union activity are a lot sort of stricter than what they previously were. So as an example, they have to go through a collective bargaining process. They have to properly ballot all of their members before they can take any industrial action. So there are a lot of hurdles for trade unions to overcome before they can get to the point that they're at today, which is strike activity. The other thing which has already been highlighted is that trade union membership is significantly lower than what it has been in previous years.
Jasmine, let's turn to you. Through your website, moneymagpie.com, you do hear from lots of ordinary members of the public. You know, Lucy Massoud's a reasonable person. She says rail workers have been underpaid. On the other hand, you know, we've had the pandemic, we've had the war in Ukraine. You know, the vast majority of the workforce aren't going to get any kind of pay rise, certainly nothing approaching the rate of inflation. Do you think the RMT have overplayed their hand?
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, 3% is not very much of a rise, because, particularly as we're saying, you know, currently we're looking at least, I would say at least 10% inflation. The problem of asking for more, of course, is that it will increase the cost of travel for everybody else. And that's going to increase inflation. You know, it's a vicious circle in a way. But you do understand that a lot of workers are saying, you know, this is the inflation rate. As you've said, we're going to have probably the nurses and the teachers following suit. Many people genuinely are wondering how they're going to pay for next week's food, you know. So I think we are going to have to expect something like this, thanks to lockdown, thanks to quantitative easing, and all of the factors.
All that money printing, yeah.
Yeah, all the money printing, which is factored in. And by the way, I didn't hear a word from the trades unions back during lockdown about how this might actually be a problem. They were just wanting us to be locked down further. So I don't have very much time for the trades unions on that. But I do understand with the workers that, yeah, they are facing really difficult situations at the moment.
Let's go back to Lucy Massoud, who's, as well as being a trade unionist, former firefighter, is a barrister at Staple in Chambers. Lucy, do you not think that the rail unions could be a little bit more flexible on working practices, on the introduction of technology? You know, Network Rail have been trying to introduce an app for a long time. The unions have resisted that. You know, people don't use ticket offices very much anymore. Surely they have to roll with the punches and move with the times. Why should a particular group of workers be protected at the expense of everyone else? Because it's not as if Network Rail is a private listed company anymore. It's a government-run company. Those surpluses that you're talking about, they go back into the rail network. They keep, you know, fares reasonably low, even though they're already among the highest in Europe.
Well, they don't necessarily just go back into the rail network. We also know that they go into the fat cat bosses' pockets.
Yeah, but that's a time. Of course, we don't want executives to get ridiculous amounts of money, but that's tiny, tiny little amounts of money compared to the amount of money of that surplus that goes back into the rail network. It's not like it's dispersed to shareholders, is it?
Well, look, Liam, you are right. It is a dynamic situation we're in. Things are changing. Certainly, lockdown has highlighted that. And hopefully many people will not be affected by today's strike because they will be able to manage the situation and work from home. But again, what we need to look at is the RMT would have been sitting down with their bosses to try and negotiate if there are job losses to be made, that it's done in a way that isn't going to impact on the workforce that we currently have, and also on public safety. Now, I remember when I was a firefighter, on the rare occasions we did or we were forced to go on strike, it was often for public safety. We were campaigning when the now Prime Minister, former Mayor, wanted to close down 10 fire stations. Well, it ended up closing down 10 fire stations in London, taking away 29 fire stations and 1,000 job losses. Now, leading up to the fire in Grenfell, the fire cover for Kensington, where Grenfell is based, was cut by 50%. So when we were going on strike and we were protesting against that, and we were balloting our members to go on strike over that, it was for public safety. And the RMT will also not only be asking for a pay rise, and actually, I take exception to the word pay rise. As Jasmine said, it's 3%. 3% is not a pay rise. That's still a pay cut. As inflation goes up, wages need to go up. Wages for the RMT have not been going up, so 3% doesn't even come close. Now, in respect to what they're doing, going on strike, etc., we have to remember the RMT are in the middle of a dispute that they want to win. So, of course, they're going to use tactics that are going to strengthen their leverage the most. It would be completely pointless if they decided to go out on strike on Boxing Day, for instance. So, yes, what they're doing is going to be inconvenient to people, but...
When kids are taking exams, Lucy, really?
Well, exactly. And this is why we need to look at the bosses and say, why are you not sitting down with the RMT? Why are you not putting a decent offer on the table? 3% is not a decent offer. It's still a pay cut.
Haven't kids suffered enough? They've missed loads of school because of the pandemic, being protected from a disease that doesn't even affect them.
Absolutely. But again, these are the same kind of arguments that were put at me when I went out on strike. People are going to lose their lives. What are you going to do if someone dies in a fire? It's this emotional blackmail that's used against workers. We already have the most restrictive laws in this country. We have the most restrictive laws in Europe about going on strike. It's very difficult to go on strike in this country. And the fact that the RMT are going on strike, you can be damn sure that the majority of their 40,000 workforce are absolutely behind them. But remember, it's a last resort for them. They don't want to go on strike. No one in the public sector ever wants to go on strike. But this isn't just them. We need to remember even the barristers are going on strike. The criminal barristers are going out the door. There's something seriously wrong in this country at the moment. People aren't getting paid a decent wage, and that's what needs to be dealt with. And those are the people we need to be blaming.
Lauren, let's hear very briefly from you. I'm sorry, a bit pressed for time. You are an employment lawyer at RWK Goodman. Do you sense that the government could try and change the law again to nip in the bud a winter of discontent with widespread strike action?
Well, I mean, Grant Shapps, I think over the weekend, has already come out, our Transport Secretary, and said he plans to reform the trade union laws further to enable striking staff effectively to be replaced by agency staff. I mean, it does normally take a number of months to get legislation like that passed through, and it will more than likely be objected. But, yes, there could be changes afoot, particularly given that we have so much strike action on the cards across different sectors at the moment.
We shall see. Lauren Harkin of RWK Goodman Employment Lawyers, and indeed Lucy Massoud. Good to have you on the show, Lucy. You are, of course, a former trade unionist and a barrister at Staple Inn Chambers. You're welcome here on The Money. And this is On The Money with me, Liam Halligan. After the break, we'll be hearing an alternative view from the Taxpayers Alliance. They're staging a protest against today's strike. So stay with us, because we're off the rails on The Money.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere. We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome back. It's 1:25. We're on the money, off the rails, because industrial action costs money. And ordinary businesses and the broader economy is suffering with this rail strike. The train system's losing millions in fare revenue. And Network Rail is, of course, largely funded by taxpayers, which means the financial hit will be shouldered mostly by the British public. So it's safe to say the Taxpayers Alliance aren't happy, so much so that they're protesting outside RMT's offices in London. Joining me live is Duncan Smith. He's Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Duncan, good to have you with us here on The Money. I guess you're not happy about this rail strike?
No, indeed. I mean, this is going to be affecting millions of people up and down the UK. Now, obviously, talks at the moment haven't been particularly successful between the Department for Transport and the rail operating companies and the unions, of course. But let's look at the wider picture of what's actually happened over the last 2 years, in particular in terms of what's gone in from taxpayers to train operating companies. There's been about £16 billion worth of support, £4 billion just for the Transport for London network. Ultimately, the wider picture of how much support has gone in is enormous. Now, there's numerous other sectors in the public sector and the private sector who are obviously very concerned about the cost of living and their wages not keeping up with inflation. But ultimately, this is not just one sector of the economy which is affected by it. Of course, people want a pay rise, I want a pay rise, everyone else does, but that's just not the reality of this situation. So I think for the RMT and other rail unions to go through this situation time and time again is pretty almost immoral behaviour. And we know that people are, for example, it's exam week, kids doing their GCSEs, A-levels, struggling to do that, hospital appointments. The impact of what they're doing between now and really to the end of the weekend is pretty disastrous, quite unfair.
Duncan, the Taxpayers Alliance, of course, you are a very analytical organisation. You study the public sector finances very, very closely indeed. Tell us about the ways in which this rail strike will impact those public finances, the ways in which taxpayers are losing out today.
Well, we do know that particular sectors across the economy will be very severely affected. Hospitality is one example. There are areas of the economy, I'll be honest, where people, for example, switched to working from home 2.5 years ago when COVID-19 struck, and for people to sort of continue working from home will be not necessarily a massive stretch for that to continue. But ultimately, yes, there will be probably quite a substantial hit to the Treasury between now and Saturday and Sunday when these strikes are going through, and for that to carry on time and time again. But let's not forget, the RMT have been threatening to carry on this process throughout the summer for many months going forward. But I would say that if the government were to fold and pay the Dane-Gale in effect and meet the demands of a 7% pay increase, what comes next? Let's not ultimately forget that the ambition of the RMT is to renationalise the railways. Now, we do have a recent example of when that was done. So the East Coast Main Line was renationalised in 2009. It was in public hands for 6 years. What actually happened during that time was that the performance of the trains went down. So the number of trains which were arriving on time went from sort of 90% to about 75% at the end of that 6-year period. It didn't generate millions and millions and billions for taxpayers of profits which would have gone to shareholders going to taxpayers. In fact, there was only 1 year where there was a dividend of, I think it was about £18 million. The overall position of money going from taxpayers to the East Coast Main Line was about £80 million. So, to renationalise the railway, which is the ultimate ambition of the RMT and similar organisations, is not a panacea for taxpayers.
Duncan Smith of the Taxpayers Alliance, good to talk to you. Good to see you here on The Money. Jasmine Birtles, MissMoneyMagpie.com. This, of course, we're seeing here how inflation upends politics, aren't we? This is happening just before these crucial by-elections in Devon, Honiton and Tiverton, and indeed in Wakefield in Yorkshire. That will impact the Conservative Party. The Labour Party, you've got Keir Starmer saying we don't support these strikes. You've got Angela Rayner, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, tweeting, yes, we do support these strikes. You've got members of the Shadow Cabinet on picket lines, even though the Labour leader's telling them not to go anywhere near these picket lines. How do you think this is going to play out? What's your instinct here? Do you think the teachers are going to follow? Do you think the barristers are going to follow? Could this be a summer into a winter of discontent?
It could be. So much of what we're going through at the moment does smell like the 70s, and I think we could easily have a winter of discontent because not only do we have inflation, but we have the spectre of recession coming along as well. So we've got potentially stagflation. And this is one of the problems, I think, that workers are going to be facing. They may not have jobs. I mean, some of them, the rail workers, the teachers, nurses, etc.
So do you think quite a lot of the public watching this show, listening on the radio, are thinking, good on the rail workers, I'd do the same? Do you think there's a silent majority who are saying that?
I don't know if it's a majority, but I think there's certainly a lot of people who are feeling that because they're thinking, I'm having real problems just paying my bills. And, we're talking about 10% inflation, 3% rise is not a lot.
So much of the private sector, they're not unionised the way they were back in the 70s. You think British Leyland in the 70s, obviously they were unionised. The car-making industry across the whole were unionised. The miners were private companies by the 1980s at the height of Arthur Scargill. They were heavily unionised. Private sector companies aren't unionised very much now, are they?
No, they're not. And, of course, we've got a lot of companies, private workers, that are doing really badly because of these rail strikes. So anybody in theatre, anybody in leisure, restaurants, pubs, they've all been struggling. And now they've got this added to it. So I think a lot of those will be feeling pretty irritated, frankly, by the workers. But at the same time, they might be thinking, well, I could do with a pay rise. Maybe I should ask my boss as well. I think there will be quite a lot of private workers who will be going, time to ask for a pay rise now.
Well, Jasmine, when On the Money began back in September 2021, we were saying, weren't we, inflation was coming. We were saying industrial action was coming. It's here with us now, and I'm sure there's much more to come.
Yes.
Jasmine Birtles, MissMoneyMagpie.com, great to have you as ever here on the show. But this is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. After the break, we'll be crossing over to GB News reporters who are hearing from ordinary folk for their take across the country on the biggest strike in a generation. And today's Money Talks interview is about something different because it's with Gordon Kerr, a highly experienced banker specialising in debt capital markets. I'll be explaining what that is. But first, it's the GB News headlines once again with Tamsin Roberts.
Liam, thank you. It's 1:31. Here's the latest from the GB Newsroom. We'll start with some breaking news this hour. And a man who murdered a couple in their home while their children slept upstairs has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 38 years. Stephen and Jennifer Chappell were both stabbed 6 times by Colin Reeves in November last year in Norton Fitzwarren near Taunton. Colin Reeves, who served in Afghanistan, launched the attack after a long-running dispute over parking. He killed the couple using a ceremonial dagger, which was given to him when he left the army. The Prime Minister has told a cabinet meeting reforms are needed on the railways as nationwide strikes cause major travel disruption across the UK. With 80% of train services cancelled, Boris Johnson warned commuters they must stay the course in the face of what he's calling unnecessary aggravation. More walkouts are planned for Thursday and Saturday, but the knock-on effects will be felt all week. Boris Johnson is urging unions and rail bosses to get back round the table to resolve the dispute.
We need the union barons to sit down with Network Rail and the train companies and get on with it. And we need, I'm afraid, everybody, and I say this to the country as a whole, we need to get ready to stay the course.
RMT General Secretary Mick Lynch says members will overcome whatever obstacles the government puts in their way.
This is a lawful dispute under the legislation that the Tories brought in themselves. And every time we meet the hurdles and break the thresholds that they brought in, they want to change the law again. We've got the most draconian laws in Western Europe and in any democracy, in fact, anti-trade union laws. Whatever they bring in, we'll meet that challenge and we'll continue to campaign. And if necessary, we'll take effective industrial action when we need to.
Well, that's all from me for now. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound is 1.226 to the dollar and 1.162 to the euro. And the price of gold currently stands at £1,495.25 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for real-time investment.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere. We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you. And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome back. It's 1:36. This is On the Money, Off the Rails on GB News TV, DAB+, digital radio and online. And we're off the rails, of course, because today the RMT Rail Union is taking industrial action. Not only today, it's Thursday and Saturday, bringing the UK's rail network to its knees. Let's go to GB News' South East reporter Ellie Costello. She's outside Victoria bus station. Ellie, what's the word? Are more people taking buses because the trains aren't running?
Liam, it is pure chaos here this afternoon at Victoria Coach Station behind me. The reality is, if you want to leave London on public transport, the only way to do so is via a coach or a bus. And I got here this morning and the place was heaving with tourists. Of course, many of them didn't realise coming to London that there would be industrial strike action this week. They were on the floor, quite literally, lots of them sitting and sleeping on the floor, trying to find a way to get around the country now, as there is this train strike as well as the tube strike, which has coincided with it today. And the buses and coaches that are leaving Victoria Coach Station are packed to the brim, going to places like Cardiff, Swansea, Glasgow and Bristol. Well, I've spoken to a few people outside the station today and I've been asking them how they've been affected by the train and tube strikes.
I have to go back to Belgium this afternoon. Normally I go by tube, but now I have to take the bus or maybe Uber, taxi or something else.
And would you support the rail workers and the tube workers that are going on strike? They want better pay?
I'm not aware of the problem, so I cannot tell anything about it.
Not really. I'm a tourist up here today. My coach doesn't go back till 5 o'clock, so I've got the day up here. I'm just relying on taxis and buses to get me around until my coach departs. So hopefully I'll find something to do. Lots to do.
I haven't been able to get any trains to work. I've been on buses since about 6:30. They keep cancelling,
keep driving past. It's impossible to get on them. They're all so packed. I've only literally just gotten to work now.
And what was it like on the buses? Were they packed? Were there loads of people?
Absolutely crammed. It's hard to even get on one. They're all just driving straight through.
And what do you think about the people who are doing this, the people who are striking? They want better pay. Do you think that they have a right to do that, or do you think there's a better way of doing it?
I think they have a right to do it, but I don't think it should impact everyone else trying to get to work. I think there's got to be other ways to go about it, 100%.
Well, there are just a few of opinions from people outside the station. It is quite difficult to gauge public opinion, though. Some people saying they fully support those who've gone out on strike. They want better pay, and of course we are in a cost of living crisis. Other people, as you just heard there, saying that there must be a better way to do this. I think, Liam, it is worth noting the impact on the economy. Business leaders have put it at around 91 million that this three-day strike will cause on the UK economy this week. And I have just taken a walk up to the local high street here, and a number of shops are closed. They've got little signs up, paper signs, saying that they will not be opening due to the tube and train strikes. So it is going to have an impact on the local economy here as well.
Ellie Costello outside Victoria Coast Station in central London. And let's cross over to King's Cross, also in London, where Rosie Wright is on a picket line. Rosie, what's the atmosphere like among the public passing? Is it supportive or angry?
Liam, it's been a really mixed picture, actually. I'm at St Pancras International Airport, and it's not airport, train station. Lots of people going to the airport, though. You still can get the train to Luton Airport Parkway from King's Cross. But lots of tourists are arriving, quite confused, actually, because they've arrived in the midst of the train strikes, and that's sort of scuppered their journey. I have to be really truthful, it's quite calm here. It's not chaos, and one ticket officer inside told me, well, people know about this who are locals. They've decided not to travel, and actually it was quite quiet yesterday, whereas normally there'd be about 25 to 30 trains going out from this station every day. Now it's more like 4 or 5 every hour. Sorry, that's 25 an hour normally, now about 4 an hour. This picket line is looking quite sparse. I was here a couple of hours ago, and there are a few more people, and quite a lot of cars coming past were hooting their horns in support. A lot of people saying, well, I really support strike action, but maybe just not this one. The key question for people who can't go out on their normal journey they'd like to today is, why are they doing this? Well, earlier I spoke to the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT Union. They're the real sort of linchpin behind this set of strikes, and I asked John Leach why.
Britain's railways are closed today as a result of RMT strike action because our members are standing up and fighting back against imposed job cuts, an attack on their terms and conditions of employment, and because of the cost of living crisis that we've got at the moment, they need a pay rise. They haven't had a pay rise for 3 years. They've had a pay freeze. We've got £2 billion worth of cuts being imposed upon the industry. This means every single ticket office is threatened with closure. It means that there's a fire and rehire process being brought onto the railway. It means that maintenance and safety regimes are going to be changed, and it means there's pension attacks coming down the chute as well.
So it comes down to pay. When pushed, John Leach said to me, they would be looking at about a 7% increase. That might be something they could agree to around the negotiating table. The Transport Minister, Grant Shapps, is saying, look, we've spent £16 billion over the pandemic. The taxpayers are now footing the bill of the railways. It's time for modernisation, and let's talk about how we could do that. In the meantime, anyone arriving through King's Cross is going to find not only difficulties at King's Cross, but St Pancras, but also on the underground as well. You can just see around there the shutters in front of the tube station there, where people would go to, you know, get the Victoria Line, the Piccadilly, maybe exploring the rest of London. They'll find that that's shut too as well. And again, that is all about pay and job insecurity. So we've got a few days of strikes to come, and are going to be inconvenient ways to travel in the days in between too.
Rosie Wright there at King's Cross. Let's cross over now to Newcastle, where our North East of England reporter Rachel Sweeney is. Rachel.
Hi, Liam. Yes, well, things are ticking along OK in the North East of England. I think that what I've heard more today than I've heard in the last 2 years is I no longer have a car. People have given up their vehicles because of the cost of living crisis. So they don't have the option to drive to work. And that's why that County Durham to Newcastle route is so important to so many people who work in Newcastle city centre, who work in Gateshead, who need to take the Tyne-and-Wear Metro, which is still running, to their destinations. People are really saying, what this comes down to is I've had to take extra hours, I've had to take on an extra job to pay my bills in the cost of living crisis, and that is what the problem is. Well, I spoke to RMT union representative Dave Lamont, and he said that this isn't about pay, it's a safety issue, and he didn't want it to come to this for the commuters.
We want to keep the railway safe. We want to be there so that we can protect the people, look after the people. That includes obviously doing the ticket checks. We're there for security. We're there to assist people who are disabled, need assistance on and off the train. We do a number of jobs on board the train. We manage the customer environment, and that's what we want to do. That's what we want to preserve. We don't want to do this. We do not want to resort to strike action. A lot of the country cannot afford it. We cannot afford it. But we feel as though we don't have a choice because we need to make our voices heard. The DfT, the government, the train company managers, they need to get around the table. They need to listen. They need to talk. We need to sort something out.
Dave Lawarn there of the RMT union up there in the northeast, talking to our own Rachel Sweeney. Rachel, we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks a lot for joining us here on The Money. And it's time now for my daily interview series, Money Talks. Almost exactly a decade ago, it was Mario Draghi, the then president of the European Central Bank, who famously promised to do whatever it takes to save the euro from destruction. At the time, Greece was on the verge of stumbling or being frog-marched out of the European single currency. And Italy, the Eurozone's third largest economy, was so mired in debt that it too was in danger of sparking the currency bloc's collapse, threatening to spread financial turmoil across the globe. Well, 10 years on, the same Mario Draghi, he's now Prime Minister of Italy, which is even more highly indebted than it was, with government debt exceeding 150% of GDP compared to around 100% here in the UK, and that's still pretty high. And there are once again growing fears and signs on global bond markets that as inflation rises and the European Central Bank starts to raise interest rates, we could see a renewed Eurozone crisis, which again could spark a wider financial meltdown. Well, joining me in this studio today is Gordon Kerr. He's a highly experienced banker who specialises in debt capital markets. Gordon advised various Eurozone governments during the last crisis and is a leading authority on the structure of the single currency. So here he is, financial analyst extraordinaire Gordon Kerr, my latest guest on Money Talks. Gordon, great to have you here in the studio. We've known each other for a long time. We've often talked about the Eurozone. You were very much involved with the last Eurozone crisis. You were advising lots of Eurozone governments behind the scenes on how they could weather that storm. People will remember a decade ago that it was really scary. It looked as if this huge currency bloc was going to break up and that would spread financial turmoil across the globe. Is that really a danger now?
Well, thank you, Liam. Yes, sir, it certainly is. In fact, the only thing that I would disagree with, a small point from your very kind introduction, is that this crisis really, we're not talking about a revival of the crisis. It's never gone away. As you pointed out, Mario Draghi's words 10 years ago indicated that, shall we say, the patient was in intensive care, drugs being pumped all over the place. Effectively, the printing press since then has been deployed to pump a great deal of money all over the place. And this has obviously been a situation which has been quite happily tolerated by governments very keen to continue to resist the exhortations of Mario Draghi when he was president of the European Central Bank for structural reforms and to reduce their spending and so forth and come back into compliance with various criteria. Far from that, they've enjoyed a situation of virtually zero interest rates, which successfully hides the fragility of their banking systems in Japanese style from the 90s. And so long as inflation stayed round about kind of non-existent, happy days. But what has significantly changed, even in the last 2 or 3 weeks, is we've entered a new phase where, the way I would phrase it is the crisis goes from covert to overt, and people are becoming aware of it. Furthermore, the European Central Bank has clearly completely dropped the ball. They have consistently maintained that they would maintain interest rates at negative levels. Now inflation is looking like plus 10% in the Eurozone. The recent approach of the European Central Bank in the last couple of weeks is to indicate forward guidance, not to actually do anything, but to indicate that they might now go along with the US Federal Reserve and start raising interest rates just at the very time when these deeply indebted countries need the support to continue in its present guise. So I think the ECB have basically mismanaged, particularly the pandemic phase. They created all these new funds, they printed money on speed, and they were always doing this to try to increase inflation. Their argument for the last 10 years was that the problems with the inflation wasn't high enough. That would drive the new tax revenues that would repay all this debt. But now inflation seems to be out of control, and they're talking about doing a complete U-turn. Well, they can't do both. They can't continue to support these weak, indebted countries and increase interest rates. One thing or the other, and this is going to lead to a political lack of confidence, and the cosy consensus is, I think, about to fracture.
Now, these are very difficult concepts. You explain them very well, Gordon. Just to amplify what you're saying, since about 2008-9, since the Lehman collapse, the financial crisis, big central banks across the world have expanded their balance sheets, created lots of money, the Federal Reserve in the US, our own Bank of England, and also the European Central Bank in the Eurozone. What you're saying is that the dangers of that, which are in many parts of the world, are amplified in the Eurozone because I think you believe, and lots of other people believe, though they're not often given a hearing, that the Eurozone as a concept just doesn't work. The idea of having, many, many different countries with many, many different elected governments, with many, many different fiscal policies, and yet just one central bank, one interest rate, one exchange rate. History shows, in your view, doesn't it, that in the end, that kind of currency bloc, unless it's a major current country that acts as one country like the United States, you can't do that in Europe because there's still, even in the Eurozone, many, many different countries with different politics and different tax and spend. Is that accurate?
Absolutely right. So one book that I was tempted to try to bring on to show your viewers was written in 1998, published in 1998, before the euro came into existence. Chapter in this book, Money and the Nation State, written by Kevin Dowd, a core member of our team, one of the world's leading monetary economists, working together with Charles Goodhart, another very
formerly
famous
from the Bank of England, of course, yeah, deputy governor.
In 1998, they were writing that this euro was a currency so poorly designed, it was as if designed by infants. And the entire purpose was traced back through the treaties to the Maastricht Treaty, which, of course, kind of converted the European economic community, the trading area, into a political union. And it was crystal clear from reading Kevin Dowd's chapter that the whole purpose of the design of the euro currency itself was as a kind of yoke, a tool to yoke the cows of Europe, all the member states together. Once in, there really wasn't...
It was a political construct, and also to look America in the eye, to try and create a reserve currency to challenge the dollar. Now, as I say, we've known each other a long time. You don't come at this, you're not... particularly a Eurosceptic. You're not trying to diss Europe. You spent most of your professional life working in and around Europe. You're extremely well connected across the Eurozone with many, many governments and officials and people from the banking establishment and so on. What you're saying, though, is that you think this crisis that we're going into, this cost of living crisis, this inflation crisis, this sharp upward leg in the interest rate cycle, you're saying that could finally expose the Eurozone as being ill-designed. Could we really see a collapse of the Eurozone? Could we see the kind of turmoil on financial markets that we saw generated in and around the Eurozone back in 2011-12? Could that return?
Yes, and to be specific, we're talking about the euro currency construct itself. And thank you, we are completely apolitical. I and all my close colleagues, John Butler, who I think you know, chaps like Bob Liddon and others, and Kevin Dowd himself, extremely talented people, we will pitch to any member state. We think the euro is likely to be the first fiat currency to have real problems. Now, we're not saying that many of the other fiat currencies are operating in a more brilliant way, as you say, with money printing, but at least they have governance. At least here in the UK, we have a government that has legal powers to compel us to use sterling. That power does not exist in the Eurozone. There are many rules which are being flouted all the time by the likes of Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Convention on converting your fiat currency from the Croatian kuna, which is scheduled to be abolished.
Yeah, the Eurozone's expanding, isn't it?
Expanding with these countries.
Set to expand at the beginning of next year,
That's
I think.
right. But there are many reasons why it might be a good thing for Croatia to join the Eurozone despite these issues, because only by becoming a member of the Eurozone, adopting the euro, do you qualify for the largesse, these 3 trillion funds in the asset purchase programme, the pandemic fund, and now, of course, the Rubicon, which has been crossed, which is the Coronavirus Recovery Fund, renamed the Next Generation EU Fund, where now, for the first time, the EU is printing money and donating it to member states as opposed to lending it to them, which is clearly a breach of its mandate.
We're almost out of time. We will get you on again in the autumn to see if what you're saying comes true, Gordon. But just to be devil's advocate, you know, I have some sympathy with your views, and I've been writing stuff along these lines myself for 15 or 20 years. But it hasn't happened yet. Aren't we underestimating the amount of political will there is to keep the Eurozone together? Aren't we, as economists, underestimating the political cohesion of this bloc?
I don't think you are underestimating. I think of the agglomeration of the member states as like the prisoner's dilemma. Everybody knows the system is broken beyond repair, but you go along with it for so long as it suits you. It's no longer going to suit some of these countries, be they small countries or even Germany, Austria and the big ones.
Gordon Kerr of Cobden Partners, great to have you here on The Money, and we will continue this very important discussion. Lots of you have been writing in with your views on the RMT strike action today. Marion says, we need someone with a backbone to stand up to the lefty unions. And for the working people of this country, like the NHS, teachers and the police, they should come first, says Marion. Nick got in touch to say the increase of wealth at the top has exploded during the pandemic. The only way to fix this mess is by reining in the wealth and greed. Wage rises for well-off rail workers and wealthy union bosses is not a solution, says Nick. And Ross says, while I agree that some rail workers aren't badly paid, I don't think we can judge unless we factor in the whole picture. Thank you for that, Ross. Thank you to all of you for your emails and tweets. That's all we've got time for today. But join me tomorrow at 1 p.m, where I'll be covering the latest inflation figures here in the UK. They're out at 7 a.m. tomorrow. I'll also be on GBNews Breakfast.
From the Met Office, warm sunny spells for much of England and Wales today, cloudier for Scotland and Northern Ireland with showers for some, but for the vast majority it is dry because of a large area of high pressure sitting in the mid-Atlantic, stopping any deep lows or weather fronts from arriving, but a couple of weak features are just about...
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere. We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.